We're ready to record. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the special city planning meeting for Monday the 10th of May. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land for which the Muanina people were custodians, and pay respects to elders past and present of the Palawapakana people of Tasmania. We have with us Alderman Briscoe, Councillor Harvey, Alderman Barakis and Councillor Dutta. We don't have an apology, but I presume that Councillor Coates will be coming soon, and nobody at present to co-opt. Item 2 is indication of pecuniary and conflicts of interest. Item 3, committee acting as planning authority, 3.1 under the Hobart interim planning scheme, 3.1.121 B Enterprise Road, and we have various deputations. Can I have somebody move that they be heard? Thank you, Alderman Briscoe. Those in favour? Aye. Those against? Items carried. I'll ask that Mr Stuart Mackenzie Hall come to the table, please. Thank you. Yeah, if you'd like to take a seat there.
Shitty week, have we?
Yeah, a long one.
And before you start, now that Alderman Thomas is here, sorry. So, Councillor Coates, if you'd like to come and sit around here, please.
If I move,
That's all right. If you come and sit here for the time being, you have 5 minutes to address the committee. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. If you wouldn't mind looking at the screen behind you, we've prepared some slides to illustrate the point. So I'm just going to be talking briefly about the inaccurate data. So what you see on the screen is a cross-section from the proponent's documents, so on Unit 19 and Unit 4, and the dotted brown line is where they've depicted the natural ground line. And according to the way they've depicted it, you can see also how they've depicted the building envelope, and it makes Unit 19 look compliant. This blue line here is where the actual ground line is, and that is simply using the proponent's data from their site plan and transferring it accurately to their cross-sections. That then means you have to redraw the building envelope, and Unit 19 becomes non-compliant, both in bulk, visual bulk, and it creates privacy discretions on the rooftop terrace and the lower deck, which is now above 1 metre above natural ground level, and closer than 3 metres to a boundary. Now, how did we arrive at that? I'm going to very quickly show you. So that's that red line I've just put on the screen. That is the accurate building envelope. So every single cross-section and natural ground line in all of the proponent's documents are grossly inaccurate. Just to show you how we achieved this, if you look at the red cross-section on the proponent's site plan, this is another example through Unit 18 and Unit 5. If I zoom in on that, their site plan shows that contour 192, just next to Unit 5, and on the boundary about 192.2. So when you plot that accurately, you get that blue line, not the brown line as they've depicted it. Now, those two angles are actually picked up in the officer's report. They've checked the GeoCortex mapping system and have found that there are in fact discrepancies, but they've been unable to assess the documents based on these discrepancies because they did not have the time due to the time pressure forced upon us by the developer. So we're going to just take you through that tonight. So I've put together this accurate three-dimensional model. Again, that 192.2, you can see it highlighted in red up the top right-hand corner. And then if you use the proponent's levels, you can see 185.7 is the lower floor of Unit 5. Simply subtract that from the 192. That puts that building 6.4 metres below ground level. But if you look at their dotted brown line, that's only 3 metres below ground level. This is a clear error, very simple to work out. The implication of it is that that red line is the accurate building envelope. That puts both Unit 18 and Unit 5 as non-compliant. The rooftop terrace of Unit 18 non-compliant, the lower deck non-compliant with the privacy provisions. This inaccuracy therefore means that all 10 of the lower 3-storey units, the row that runs along the bottom of the block, are all non-compliant with the building envelope and all have privacy discretions. This error also shows up on the proponent's shadow diagram. So as you know, once you're outside of the acceptable solutions, you have to be able to assess, well, what is the impact on neighbouring units and on the units to each other. So using this example on the left, at 1500 hours, 21st of June, middle of winter, the developer's shadow diagram I've outlined in red there, you can see what they're saying is the impact of the shadow cast by Unit 14. On the right is my accurate 3D model, and that red arrow right there is the end of the shadow cast by Unit 14. That's all the way down onto the neighbour's land and beyond Unit 11. So it's about 5 times longer than what the proponent says it is. And indeed, it also overshadows neighbouring Unit 13. So these do have adverse impacts. I feel bad for the Officer of Council because he literally had no time to wade through 213 detailed representations and almost 600 pages of developers' documents, which are full of inaccuracies. So he's really unable to assess it as its reality is. They can only assess it as the imaginary set of documents that were put forth. So we're asking Council today to please put up an additional ground for refusal based on the inaccuracy of the documents. And this is supported by 2 independent planners, another planner and 3 architects. Thank you.
Thank you. Your time's just finished, so thank you for that. I'll open it to committee and Alderman Thomas for questions. Any questions? Alderman Briscoe.
Just very quickly, the developer could dig in all the units down 3 metres, couldn't they? And they would then comply?
The only issue with that is that they would have to redesign, because everything's connected to their central access road, and they have to be strictly to the right levels and gradients to meet the Australian standards for parking and access. So if you dug down the front row, all the garages moved down 3 metres, you'd have to dig down the back row. They're already underground, or they're at roof level. So now you would have 9-metre cuts instead of 6 at the back, all along the back 10 units in dolerite, which I've never even seen physically possible to do, let alone the enormous cost that would entail. So practically speaking, I think the answer is theoretically they could do it, but in reality it would be just not feasible from a cost point of view, and therefore, you know, they can't comply with the building envelope as it stands on that site because they're just trying to overdevelop it.
Further questions?
Just a bit more supplementary, but you're aware that the Planner's Office report about the possible inaccurate levels suggested that if that was found to be correct, that it was inaccurate, they would have to submit another planning application.
I am aware of that, and yes, thank you.
Right. Are there any other questions? Just in relation to the parking decks or any sort of outdoor parking, and if that anomaly transpires, what sort of impact would that have on those?
The outdoor parking is only really for the visitors, so all of the parking for the units themselves are contained inside the residences in double garages, usually on the middle level of the lower row and usually the lower level of the upper row. And so is your question more about the outside parking?
The outside parking, yes.
Yes, I mean, again, that's feasible, but you'd have to reduce it. You'd have to cut down through the dolerite, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Harvey?
So, assuming you're correct and council's already acknowledged that, problems with the ground levels, what would we end up with here in order to construct this? How much sort of quarrying, how much quarrying would need to be done? It sounds like if you're suggesting 6 metres worth of dolerite would need to be quarried out from the site, across the whole site?
So I've accurately calculated this in my representation, and as it's designed right now, using the real natural ground levels without adjusting it down to make it comply, it takes out 19,000 cubic metres of rock, but when that rock is dug out, it has a swell factor of 72%, so it goes to 33,000 cubic metres. And our question to council was, is this a level 2 activity? Because a mining lease is required if you dig out 5,000 cubic metres in a year. Now, this is 7 times the amount of the requirement for a mining lease. So it's going to create about 11,000 truck movements. We're talking, 12 tonners that can only carry about 6 cubic metres of dolerite because it's so heavy. So that's why it needs 11,000 truck movements. And that's not taken into consideration in the traffic impact assessment as additional wear and tear on these very narrow, congested roads. So it's problematic for a number of reasons. I also have done the calculations myself, and just roughly, I think there's $1.2 million worth of rock breaking that would take at least a year, and that's conservative. That doesn't even include the trucks. That's just 2 30-tonne excavators hammering away night and day for a year. And so I just personally think if I was the developer, and I'm not opposed to development at all, as you know, I do development for a living.
I think that's probably beyond the answer to the question.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah,
no
yeah,
problem.
that's fine. And I'm just conscious of time. So thank you. We'll, if you'd like to resume your seat.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you. And now for Ms. Jocelyn McPhee.
So in reading through all the representations that you possibly did over the weekend, you will have noticed that a large number of them expressed concerns about the amount of clearing that's proposed at the site of development. Now, that site, if you look at the screen behind you, is on the northern slopes of Mount Nelson and now almost entirely bushland. That white polygon shows approximately where the development site is, and higher up the slope there's an environmental living zone that stops at that green dashed boundary, above which is Bicentennial Park. Now, the representors would understand that there's going to be clearing within that white polygon. Understand and expect it. But what they don't expect is that a very wide zone around that polygon is also going to be proposed to be cleared, starting along the back row of dwellings around the southeastern side and then down the front. That clearing pattern largely results from 2 controls. One, it's a bushfire-prone slope. And secondly, the developer has chosen to mitigate the flame zone hazard with bushfire attack level 12.5, which is the lowest permissible for construction standards. So it's actually the developer's choice of 12.5 that leads to that clearing. It's not a mandatory requirement of the planning scheme. Looking at really the same information but in plan view, what you can see here are 2 other factors that contribute to the wide footprint. The first is to note is the cleared zone, the greenish and pink, around the development site, and that the developer has chosen to put 20 multi-storey dwellings on that site, so a dense development, and that they're situated close to the boundaries, particularly along the back boundary. They're only 1.5 metres away. Those 3 choices, the BAL 12.5 and the density and the siting together require that wide zone of clearing. And it's important to emphasise that this impact is outside the development site, well beyond the development site. The next point I want to make is that this approach has 2 further undesirable impacts. The red line encloses the area to be cleared, and the bright green shows a biodiversity protection area which is overlapped by that hazard management clearing, and the blue pattern shows the area related to a protected waterway, both of which are impacted by those choices of 12.5, high density, and siting close to the boundaries. In fact, there's been no attempt to minimise those impacts. The codes that relate to biodiversity and to protected waterways both recommend or require avoiding impacts and minimising impacts. And clearly the developer has choices about the bushfire attack level for the construction materials and about the density and about the siting. So my final statement is on behalf of the 213 representors, and that is that the Planning Committee consider adding 2 more grounds for refusal. One related to non-compliance with respect to the biodiversity protection area, and one related to non-compliance with the protected waterway.
Thank you very much. Right, any questions? Councillor Harvey?
With regard to the clearing, hazard management clearing to meet the that particular level of bushfire attack level, is that all on the proponent's land, or is there land that will need additional land outside that they own?
It's not all on the proponent's land. The proponent owns the land along the back boundary and a little way along the southeastern boundary, but at the front, the land is not owned by the developer and will require consent from that other owner.
So the big block of land to the right end, facing the screen, is not their land?
That's right. That's 26 Edith Avenue and owned by EBCO Developments.
Further questions? Thank you. If you'd like to take your seat. Now go, after, let me just sanitise.
Yes,
I'll now call upon Mr Peter Sibley to undertake your deputation. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about traffic. The high density of these proposed units results in adverse consequences from the units all the way to Churchill Avenue. The traffic volume of the proposed 5-stage 4 units at a time construction program, probably in excess of 4 years, would also create major traffic congestion. The first picture shows a plan view of the unit development. You will see the green markers on the access road which indicate where it narrows to 3.2 metres, which makes it difficult or impossible for a fire truck to enter. I don't believe any of us here or any of our fellow 213 objectors believe that this would not expose the people in the units in a firestorm to an acceptable life-threatening risk and restrict the access of fire truck help. This proposal allows for a new road to be cut through the sloping terrain on the multi-user right-of-way just 5 metres outside the driveway to my house number 25 and my neighbour number 27. This is shown in the picture with a simulated alignment of cars coming from both directions. It is obvious that the cut through the steep terrain is going to be out of eye line of residents coming from 25-27. There would be 214 traffic movements coming downhill at a steep angle to the current 32 from my driveway. My family and I are terrified of this proposed dangerous road. Oops, what's happening? On the next slide, we see the narrow right-of-way in this proposal now producing 264 traffic movements. That is a 405% increase feeding into Enterprise Road with just 203 traffic movements. The narrow laneway has become the major traffic carrying road and has limited line of sight. In addition to this, we have calculated that 11,000 truck movements would be required to cart dolerite away from the site due to extensive excavations during the project. This would be a risk to infrastructure and safety on all roads. This picture shows the one-way out road system. All roads are half-width, steep and winding compared to York Street, View Street or King Street as examples in Sandy Bay. 7 intersections going down the hill until we come to a severe elbow junction marked with 2,160 traffic movements. The increase in the traffic at this point would be 10% due just to this proposed project. The junction is important as it is a meeting with Bedome Street, which is often heavily parked out with up to 60 cars. And there you see an example of the cars parked in Bedome Street. You see the elbow coming that I talked about with the 2,100 traffic movements. Anyway, our conclusion from this is this proposal does the following. It ignores compatibility with community rules. It ignores the transition of density to the bushland and ignores those rules. It ignores the density rules. If this proposal can do that, it sets a precedent. The proposal can then apply to put 30 plus units on 21A, which it owns. That is many more houses than those that already exist on Enterprise Road now. A traffic nightmare would go to a disaster. The top of the road network would crush the bottom. People on this hillside are concerned about traffic now. That is a big reason for the 213 representations. The existing neighbourhood traffic network is on the edge under normal conditions. It is a compromised system. This proposal dumps another 10% of activity at least onto an already struggling system. Then add to this 11,000 by 12-tonne rock trucks movements and all the construction traffic over 4 years that the TIA ignores. Then add a bushfire emergency and the inability for emergency vehicles trying to get up to the site, as per the picture there, while trying to pass all the escaping residents along the way in a one-way out bottleneck. Then add another 15% from the Stage 2 development on 21A, if the precedent is set on 21B, and you have the perfect storm, which we all know would be a complete disaster. Please consider our request for additional grounds drafted by our independent planner, Fraser Reid. We, the 213 representatives, and our families need your help. This is in your hands. Please look after us.
Thank you, Mr Sibley. Are there any questions? So you've done a lot of those traffic, that traffic impact, and it's also from the report that was provided?
Yes, I've used all the figures from the report, all their figures. But I must say, this is a unique road system. It's narrow. Everything's narrow. And as I said, Bedome Street's often parked out. You see the rubbish truck coming up there. That can barely get up the road. Even on the roads that are only parked on one side, people are reluctant to pass each other. It's only drivers with extreme skill will do that. And that's, this just hasn't come up now. People are always concerned about traffic flow in this area. I don't think the forefathers of this town or this city envisaged developments like this going on right up the top of the hill when they started constructing these roads. And,
Right, yeah.
you know, I think it's just grown like topsy.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Duddy, you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Just a question to you. With regards to development itself, you're not against development?
No, and neither is the neighbourhood. When this was first, this land was first put up for sale, it was put up for sale for 4 houses to be built on that site, and people were quite relaxed with that. But I must say, we got a hell of a shock when there were 20 units proposed. And by the way, these units are all house-sized. They are 4-bedroom and 3-bedroom units,
Thank you.
71 bedrooms altogether.
Were there any other questions? No further questions. If you'd like to take your seat, thank you. Now, call upon Mr. Fraser Reid on behalf of Gillian Sibley. Thank you.
Thank you all. There is some additional grounds of refusal that I have drafted, and I just wanted to talk through those, and then really I suppose I'm more available for any questions you may have. The first one really is to do with this fundamental issue of the accuracy of the information. Without that information and with those errors, it is not possible to actually undertake a proper assessment under the planning scheme. I understand, the council officer's response to that, and that really there is no time to actually verify it with an alternate survey. I know council has done that many other times. In this case, there's not, but I think you'd have to see from some of the work prepared by the representors in multiple representations that there is significant concern about the accuracy of the information. So I've drafted an additional ground there, which I think is quite a reasonable ground for the council to put. It goes to the fundamental matters under clause 8.1 of the scheme of the information required. The matter of density, I know council in the report talks about some legal advice it's had around what does access strip mean, and elected members will be familiar with this concept where you have a battle axe lot, the battle axe handle is excluded from the site for the density consideration, and obviously the fundamental concern there is that what's the available area of the site for development. In this case, there are large right-of-ways that go over the entry of this site. In my representation, I calculated that the impact of those and associated pavements and significant embankments required to facilitate that access are in the order of 1,800 square metres. So on that basis, the site is actually over density. And I don't think you'll need much convincing to see that the density is inconsistent with the density of the surrounding area. So I've drafted an additional ground in relation to density, and that's number 3. Number 4 is the matter of siting. I think the proposal is quite clearly outside the permitted building envelope. And then that requires a consideration of impacts on the visual impact and overbearing appearance of the proposal. Given the 3-storey facades sited close behind these other buildings, there is a significant concern about an overbearing appearance, and I've drafted a further ground on that basis. The matter of privacy really comes down to whether these decks comply with the building envelope and the setbacks and the heights. I think they're over 1 metre above ground on a proper assessment, which raises all these considerations about privacy relative to the neighbours. I've drafted another ground about that. Jocelyn spoke to the matters of biodiversity protection and the waterway and coastal protection overlays, and I've drafted additional grounds around those. Now, it'd sort of be in your hands, or if there are any specific questions that I can assist with, it's probably the most useful thing for you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions particularly on these grounds?
Thanks, Chair.
Alderman Thomas?
Mr Reid, if you had been asked by the developer to put this application in, what would your first three comments would have been to the developer, given the proposal as it is now and given your comments just then?
Well, look, I think it's obviously a very steep site, so you'd have to have a very good handle on what the topography is, what are the levels of the site, and then how that access works. So in my experience on these sites, the fundamental issues of access and how, this number of vehicles, safe access in and out of the site and manoeuvring on site, fire access, not going beyond the boundaries of your site, and again, not going into the biodiversity area in terms of your bushfire management. Do what you can to minimise the need for bushfire management by having a higher standard of construction. Those are the sorts of things, and I think my overriding consideration in all of these things are, how can you be respectful of the neighbours, because that will avoid their issues the best you can within the planning scheme. There are other things you can do over and above that reduce the impacts on the neighbours, which we've spoken about before.
A supplementary question, Chair, if I could. Based on the size of these, and as we've heard, these are basically 20 houses because of the size. What's your estimate as a professional in terms of a lot of them are 3 and 4 bedroom, in terms of the total number of vehicles that would likely to be on site?
Look, I would just refer to what the planning scheme parking and access code requires, which is 2 spaces per dwelling plus 1 visitor space for every 4 dwellings. So that's about as far as a planner I would advise. You can have 10 bedrooms and you don't need more parking spaces, but in terms of the traffic consideration and things like that, that does factor into the expected number of vehicle movements. I've read many traffic reports where they have a feel for what the number of bedrooms are, and they used to go around 9 or 10 vehicle movements a day depending on the dwelling size.
Okay. Councillor Dutta, did you have a question?
Just a question with regards to having read the report from the council. It appears they are quite satisfied with biodiversity clauses and also the waterways. Yes. I don't see any strong reasoning, because they're quite reasonable according to the way they have justified it. Would you agree?
Look, I look at it a different way, because they seem to say, well, the amount of clearing or fuel modification in those areas is, it's not total clearing because we're removing a certain number of trees, and then it's about managing the undergrowth. But the obligation of both of those codes is to avoid and minimise to the reasonable extent, or the maximum extent, I think it is, the words, practical. And when you've got a dense development being sited directly adjacent to the side boundaries and the rear boundary, and at the lowest standard of construction, how you could possibly say that those tests of minimising those impacts to the greatest degree, and the terminology is in my in the drafted grounds of refusal, but that's how I see it. I think the test is, what are they doing to actually meet their obligation to minimise those impacts, and they're not, because they're doing exactly what they want at the lowest standard of construction right up against the side boundary. How could you come to that conclusion? Well, obviously, I respect the officers and they've come to a different conclusion, but I think the way I look at it is a very reasonable way to look at it.
Mr Reid, the relationship of the houses effectively directly below to the proposal, what is there anything specifically that you're referring to for grounds for refusal?
It is really the siting standard there. So there's 2 aspects. One is they've sort of got a retaining wall along the bottom of the lots, bottom of the houses. It's a bit hard to determine exactly how high that is, and clearly if the levels are out, then it would be different again. Who knows what that is? And then there's a privacy type screen on top of that. So you've got this massive sort of 3 metre plus wall the whole way along the bottom of the site. So that's the first thing. And then inside that, then you've got the buildings themselves, which are outside the building envelope. And then they're 3 stories high, sort of within 4 metres of the boundary. They're a bit less than that, a bit more than that in other places. But, sheer face directly adjacent to the rear boundary, and we're all familiar with how you normally set back behind the rear boundary of a property. This is sort of dealt with as if it's a side boundary and it's directly overlooking those properties. So, I think that ground for my additional thing covers the concern, and it links into the privacy consideration, which is the next one.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, I'll ask you to take your seat. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll hear from the applicant, Mr. Brian Richardson, and planner Irene Duckett. Thank you. Now, if you'd like to address some of the things that have been raised.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for calling this meeting a lot earlier than was originally proposed. This application, this development proposal has been taken nearly 3 years to go through the process. It is the subject of a second application. The first application was withdrawn by the developer, and on the advice from the council, and we have come up with a second design. I'd like to point out a couple of things from my perspective. Firstly, we went to a lot of trouble to ascertain that the parcel of land that is associated with this title is actually 7,265 square metres, which allowed for the 20 units. The other thing I'd like to point out is that the survey was provided to me by Peacock, Darcy and Anderson surveyors. The land contours, they were all provided as part of the, right at the beginning of this development, and that is the basis of the contours that are shown on the drawings. So we can only go by the information we were given by the experts. We did engage quite an amount of advice from various experts, if you could say, things like the fire protection, the biodiversity, landscaping, engineering, all those have been provided, but in particular the Pitt and Sherry, who did a lot of the stormwater, sewer, the traffic impact and all that. They were all heavily involved with that, and they liaised with the council staff to discuss the aspects of all within their own specific areas. One of the reasons we requested, we weren't prepared to sign an extension of time past today, is that the delays have been held up by a lot of council staff, in particular the engineering, and they were very, very difficult to contact. And I know Pitt and Sherry tried on several occasions to address information that was requested back in September last year in a letter from the planning officer, and it took quite a long time to be able to address the information. Consequently, we're now talking in May. It has taken so long to get through the system. I'd like to now pass to Irene Duckett, who will talk about some of the other aspects.
Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to remind the committee, I'm sure you're aware of your obligations as planning authority, that you're assessing the application as it's been submitted. That is, you make a decision about the documentation as it stands. If the representatives are correct and the plans are incorrect, then it is the developer's problem to try and comply with that. But it's not the committee's role to be taking on board other information that's being handed over today that may correct or supplement the application that's made. Your obligation is to deal with the application as it's made.
Thank you.
On that basis, we would endorse the planning assessment as being provided by council officers, planning office in particular, in terms of the building envelope discretions and the compliance with the planning scheme standards for residential dwellings. On that assessment, there are only 4 dwellings that don't comply with the building envelope, and the assessment shows that there are no impact in terms of residential amenity that's arising from those 4 dwellings. The site is zoned general residential. It is capable of supporting 20 dwellings, and 20 dwellings are compliant with the density of the site. So that is not a matter of contention, as controversial as it seems. The access area has been assessed by council and removed from the total area for density. It has included the right-of-ways, the carriageway, and the balanced land still complies with the dwelling density. The only ground refusal that's been put forward by the council officers is in relation to traffic. I will point out that that standard talks about the proportionate number of cars and the increase in cars, not the total number of cars on the road. So, for example, the structure of that clause refers to the 20% increase. The existing number of vehicle movements per day in Enterprise Road is 699. Less than 20% increase in traffic movements would be 140 cars. So the application is seeking 214. In actual terms, this variance is 85 vehicle movements per day, which doesn't add or subtract from vehicle conflict points, as the likely movements will be in the same direction as the current flow of traffic. Also, interestingly, if this application was submitted in 2 stages, it would comply with the acceptable solution, because it comply with the percentage increase, not the total number. The proposal is fully supported in relation to the increase in traffic by the accompanying TIA, and responding to the issues raised by the representatives in relation to the waterways and biodiversity issues, we'd also support the assessment which was undertaken by council officers, as well as the supporting report by North Barker, which does support that the application has met a satisfactory standard in terms of mitigation.
Okay, we might open it for questions. So start with you, Alderman Briscoe. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a question for Ms. Duckett. 26 Edith, sorry, I got the wrong address. 26 Edith Avenue is required to, some land clearing there is required, and also stormwater infrastructure has to go into that area, but that's not owned by your client. And we have a letter from the owner of 26 Edith Street saying they're not giving permission for stormwater infrastructure. How would you like to respond to that?
With regards to stormwater, it was design was done by Pitt and Sherry. It was approved by the council engineering people to show that it actually connected into the waterway that was at the far end of the development. Yes, it goes in through the subdivision that's being proposed at the present time by the owners of that large land we saw earlier on in the red area. There's a subdivision application already within council. My client actually has suggested that he might be interested in buying 1 or 2 of those blocks to give himself a better access, but at the present time he can't because they're not on the market. But certainly the stormwater was approved by council to go into the waterway that was at the end of the site.
Okay, well, obviously I have to ask, I'll ask some questions of the officer a bit later on. But however, unless you've got an agreement with the owner of 26 Edith Street and a big area that is under your plans to be cleared for...
There's no formal agreement.
Right, there's no formal agreement, but...
Other than the direction from the council.
Right, we might address that to the planning officers.
Thank you.
Any further questions? There are no further questions. If you'd like to take your seats
Can I
again.
just make reference to, my owner does, the developer owner does own the land above at 21A Enterprise Road. He does have an intentions to develop it, but because one of the reasons we knew of the report from the fire safety report is that he has control of that land, so he can make sure that he complies with the setbacks that are required to achieve the fire buffer zone and everything like that.
Thank you,
Because
Mr Richardson. And I've just, since you're still there, I'll ask you a question. You didn't want to extend the time for further consideration when we're doing this right before a council meeting. You weren't prepared to extend the time for this to be considered?
At the time, I could say that my developer was very annoyed that he'd been delayed so much by council staff in making the assessment, and that's why initially we weren't prepared to sign any extension from about a week ago. I think it was the 5th of May. But when we were advised about this meeting today, we were prepared to sign an extension of time up until tonight.
Thank you. If you'd like to take your seats again, thank you. Right, I'll open the item for discussion. We'll start with you, Alderman Briscoe.
Yes, because I asked the question. When you put in a development application, for any application, now this came up, I think, with the Newtown Hospital, that does the owner of the land that's being affected by this development application in other clearing and stormwater through their property need to consent to the development on their property?
Not for the purposes of lodging a planning application and its determination by council.
But if they fail in the end after they have determined, say for example, development would go ahead, the development stalled for that reason, wouldn't it?
Well, that's right. You'd ultimately need the consent of the landowner to undertake certain works on an adjacent property.
We've received a letter from the owner saying that they do not give permission for the stormwater.
Yep.
That in itself will stop the development, would it?
Look, there may be other means in which to obtain stormwater connection without agreement, but I go back to my original statement. We're here dealing with a planning application. You don't need the consent of the owner of the land in which to allow that application to be lodged and determined by council.
Could I just clarify that a bit more? So I could put an application for development on a block I don't own, get it assessed. Yeah, it seems ridiculous.
Yeah, that's correct. I could lodge an application on your property.
Feel free to.
Any further discussion, or do we have a motion? Councillor Harvey?
Chair, I'm happy to move the officer's recommendation for refusal based on the first part there.
I want to add those extra ones.
Proposal does not meet the acceptable solution or the performance criteria with respect to clause E 5.5.1 A3 or P3 because of the increase in vehicular traffic at an existing access or junction in the area subject to a speed limit of 60 km an hour or less will not be safe and will be unreasonable impact. That one. With regard to all of the other suggested grounds for refusal, it sounds like the council wouldn't defend those, or what would the director's response? What is the director's response to those additional grounds that have been suggested by the opponents?
Mr Noy.
Well, it's the assessing officer's view that he clearly hasn't felt he can defend those other grounds. So that's the officer's position. if you would like my further view, and then you may be able to sustain an argument around citing, refusal on citing, but that would be the only one if council committee were of the mind to add further grounds. That would be the only other one that you might be able to defend.
But the levels one?
That is the building envelope, the setback. In relation to the inaccuracy of the information, we are certainly not, we would be reluctant on the evidence before us at the moment to suggest that you include that one.
The planning officer have indicated that they had doubts from their own investigations that diagrams were wrong.
That's just continue.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted clarification.
Yeah. So,
And I think Councillor Dutta might have that amendment as well after you've finished.
yep. So look, I'll just move the original officer's recommendation for now, and we'll see what else happens
You, Councillor Dutta?
during the debate.
Chair, I would suggest that I would want, add another ground of refusal to that if Councillor Harvey is happy to consider that. I read that the other ground would be that the proposal does not comply with the acceptable solution or performance criteria for clause 10.4.2A3 and P3 of the Hobart Interim Planning Scheme, because the setting and scale of the dwellings will cause an unreasonable loss of amenity by visual impacts caused by the apparent scale, bulk, and preparations of the dwellings when viewed from adjoining lots.
Thank you. Any comments? Alderman Brock.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, normally I'm the first one to suggest deferrals or suggest ways to find, ways to mediate these developments into something that is approvable. But I think it is pretty clear, and it was pretty clear from meeting with the residents and having a look at the site and getting their presentation, that this is pretty clearly outside of, I think, what anybody would consider appropriate for the area. I'm actually surprised, and I'd be probably leaning towards supporting the motion with Councillor Dutta's amendment. I was quite surprised that it was recommended for refusal for such a small number of reasons, to be honest. But look, I'll leave it there. I'm hoping that something can get developed there, because I think it's a good spot for some residential development. But I think what was put forward was completely over the top.
Thank you. Alderman Briscoe.
Yes, look, I think the officer's report does indicate that there may be inaccurate information, and I think that an additional ground of refusal is about the inaccurate information, because in the planning report it does indicate that the planning officer had done investigations internal and found that it didn't match the internal. So I would hope that if there is an amendment that from Councillor Dutta that includes the application does not meet the application requirements of clause 8.1 because there is reasonable concern that the plans includes discrepancy, including in relation to the width of access levels and heights. It is not possible to make a proper assessment of compliance with the relevant standards of the planning scheme based on information provided. Now, if that's in it, then it might get knocked off at the appeals tribunal if it goes to the tribunal, but at least there is some evidence in the planner's report that there is a likelihood or reasonable concern that the information is not accurate. So I think that would be defendable by our officers.
Do you want a comment from Mr. Noy?
Yeah, well, I think he did make a comment a moment ago, but another comment, yes?
Look, I can only go on the evidence that's been presented. If it's this information as submitted is based on surveying diagrams, surveying work on the ground, then we'd have to be guided by that information as opposed to maybe a discrepancy with the information on GIS. So what I'm saying is, I've given my answer before. I don't think we can necessarily defend that, but we will do so if instructed to.
Do you want to take that separately or?
Yeah, well, if Councillor Dutton doesn't want to include it, then I'm happy to move it as a foreshadowed amendment as well.
Okay, you wanted to say something, Councillor Harvey?
Yeah, just, thank you, Chair. Did the officers have enough or adequate time to fully assess this, or was it a rushed thing? Here it is at a meeting before a council meeting, at a special meeting. So was there adequate time to
Look,
assess it?
these things, when you get that many representations, it does take a considerable amount of officer time to digest what's being raised and to analyse. So I would say never enough time, Chair, but we were able to analyse it and assess it sufficiently enough to make a recommendation.
Just in relation, Mr Noy, to the amount of quarrying that might have to be undertaken, how's that considered in the report?
Yeah, look, this matter arose, the issue of whether it constitutes a level 2 activity arose out of the Montpelier Retreat, Arley Sultan development. There were subsequent changes, as I understand it, to that provision that limited that provision to licensed quarries, not construction sites, as I understand it.
And the amount, the likelihood, I mean, that's going to have a huge impact on traffic movements, is it not, during construction? The road system there is fairly tight, and construction vehicles will create some issues, but there's been a lot of construction occur in that area over time, and it's managed. So I'm sure ultimately that the road system will be able to cope with that sort of construction. Okay. Now we have a couple of amendments which we might take separately. So perhaps if you can read Alderman Briscoe's amendment, Mr. Banks.
Briscoe's. The application does not meet the application requirements of clause 8.1 because there is reasonable concern that the plans include discrepancies included in relation to the width of access, level and heights. It is not possible to make a proper assessment of the compliance with the relevant standards of the planning scheme based on the information provided.
It's Councillor Dutton.
Yeah, I think that was Councillor Dutton's.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Sorry. Yours was citing, was it?
Yes.
Does not meet the acceptable solution of the performance criteria A3 or P3 of clause 10.4.2. That was yours.
It's an accuracy of information.
It is.
It was right up the top.
Yes.
Read it out if you like.
Yeah, okay. If you read it out, I think we know. So
the application does not meet the application requirements of clause 8.1 because there is a reasonable concern that the plans include discrepancy, including relation to the width of access, levels and heights, and it is not possible to make a proper assessment of compliance with the relevant standards of the planning scheme based on the information given. I'm happy to provide that to you.
Yep, thank you. I'll put that amendment. Those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? It's carried. The other amendment is in relation to citing, and I think we've heard that. Yeah. So if everybody's happy, I'll put that amendment. Those in favour? Those against? That amendment is carried. It now becomes part of the substantive motion. Those in favour? Aye. Those against? Items carried unanimously. And that will be heard at the next meeting, which will start in approximately 1 minute. Meeting closed. Thank you.